They told her she was too old to dream, too fragile to travel, too late to begin again. At 78, Eleanor was expected to stay home quietly, fading into the background. Instead, she packed a battered suitcase and set off sending postcards from Paris, Rome, and beyond, each one defying the voices that tried to confine her. What began as one woman's rebellion against age turned into a movement that spread across generations, sparking journeys she could never have imagined. But the moment that left her family, her town, and eventually an entire nation speechless wasn't where she went, it was what she brought back. The letter had come in a tone so polite it almost disguised the sting. At your age, it read, perhaps you should reconsider such ambitions. Long-distance travel can be difficult, if not dangerous. The words were wrapped in professional concern, but the meaning was clear. Too old, too fragile, too much of a liability. Eleanor sat with it in her hands for a long time, the paper trembling only slightly, not from weakness, but from anger. She refused to let show in front of her grandchildren. At 78, she was used to being underestimated. The doctor who clucked his tongue when she insisted on walking unaided. The bank clerk who explained the online portal as if she were a child. The travel agency's dismissal was just the latest entry in a long line of quiet erasures. But Eleanor had not spent decades raising 3 children alone, keeping a small bookshop afloat through recessions, and nursing her husband through illness, only to shrink into the background of her own life. She had learned resilience in the hardest of ways. She also knew that indignation meant little unless you acted on it. That night, she cleared the dining table of the unopened mail and laid out maps she had saved from her younger years. Europe, South America, and the narrow band of Southeast Asia she had always dreamed of seeing. She spread them flat, tracing the faded lines of rivers and mountain ranges with a fingertip, as though reacquainting herself with long-lost friends. Her grandchildren, curious, asked what she was doing. Planning, she said simply. Their eyes widened as she explained she was going to travel the world to learn. They laughed at first, thinking she was joking, until she returned the next day with a worn leather suitcase she had kept from her youth. She polished the brass clasps, tightened the straps, and placed it at the foot of her bed. It wasn't just a suitcase, it was a declaration. Eleanor sold her car, something that startled her children, who begged her to reconsider. She used the money to book flights and train tickets. She wasn't reckless. She carried her medical records neatly organized in a folder, made arrangements for regular check-ins with her family, and researched every location for accessibility and safety. Still, her children remained unconvinced. "It's too much for you," they said. "You'll regret it." She smiled gently but firmly. "I'll regret not trying." The first stop was Paris, a city she had only read about in books she once stocked on her shelves. Standing before the Eiffel Tower on a crisp spring morning, she felt none of the frailty the travel agent had warned her about. She felt alive, her heart keeping time with the steady stream of visitors around her. She sent a photo to her family. That evening, her, in a bright red scarf, standing beneath the tower with a grin that made her look 20 years younger. The responses came quickly. First shock, then delight, and finally a flood of questions. Where are you going next? From there, it was Rome, where she stood inside the Colosseum and thought about endurance. Then Istanbul, with its labyrinthine bazaars where she haggled for spices with a confidence that surprised even herself. In Kyoto, she knelt carefully at a temple garden, her joints stiff but her spirit flexible, soaking in the stillness. At every stop, she collected something: postcard, a pressed flower, a train ticket. She mailed them home in envelopes that arrived like little jolts of disbelief to those who had doubted her. Her children stopped telling her to turn back. Instead, they began showing her photos to friends and neighbors, proud in spite of their earlier skepticism. The travel agency that had dismissed her received one of her postcards to go on the back. In her tidy cursive, she wrote, "Not too old, just on time." Months passed, and Eleanor's journey became more than sightseeing. She met other travelers, young and old, who marveled at her determination. A young couple in Argentina told her she reminded them of the grandmother they had lost. In Morocco, a shopkeeper insisted she take a handcrafted bracelet as a gift after hearing her story. In Peru, she struggled with the altitude but made it to the edge of Machu Picchu, sending back a photo of herself, leaning proudly on her walking stick, with the ruins spread behind her. When she finally returned home, she gathered her family in the living room. On the coffee table, she placed a large wooden box she had carried back from her last stop in India. One by one, she pulled out the mementos, each with a story attached. The children listened in awe, the adults with quiet humility. By the time she finished, the room was silent, filled with the weight of what she had shown them. Not just the places she had been, but the undeniable truth that life did not end when society decided it should. Her son finally broke the silence. "You proved us wrong, Mum." Eleanor smiled, her eyes glinting with both triumph and gentleness. "I didn't do it to prove you wrong. I did it to remind myself, and maybe you too, that we're never too old to live the life still waiting for us." What she had sent them, postcards, photos, souvenirs, was more than proof of her travels. It was a message, a reminder that courage does not retire with age, and dreams do not expire simply because others lose faith. She had left them speechless, yes, but she had also left them something far more enduring: permission to believe in their own unfinished journeys. The morning after her return, Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar stillness of her own bedroom. For months she had grown accustomed to the rhythms of trains pulling into stations, the muffled hum of conversations in languages she couldn't quite decipher, and the occasional disorienting thrill of waking in a place where she had to remind herself what country she was in. Now, the silence of home pressed around her, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if it had all been a dream. But then she looked to the corner of her room, where the battered suitcase sat slumped against the wall, its stickers and scuffs telling a story too vivid to doubt. She made tea and opened the curtains, sunlight spilling across the dining table, where she had once spread her maps. The maps were gone now, replaced by a thick stack of envelopes waiting for her attention. Letters had arrived during her travels, carefully stacked by her neighbor who had checked in on the house. She began opening them one by one, her fingers moving with deliberate patience. Most were bills or advertisements, the small clutter of ordinary life, but tucked between them was something unexpected. Handwritten notes from strangers. One was from a young woman in Illinois who had seen her story on a travel blog. "My mother stopped traveling after she turned 60. The letter read, "She thinks the world doesn't want her anymore. I showed her your picture in Paris. She cried and said maybe she was wrong." Another was from a man in his 40s, writing from a veterans hospital. "You reminded me of the strength I thought I'd lost," he wrote. "If you can carry a suitcase across continents, maybe I can carry myself into tomorrow." Eleanor pressed the pages to her chest, overwhelmed by the realization that her journey had rippled out far beyond her small family. Later that week, her daughter invited her to speak at a local community center. "You don't have to give a speech, Mom," she had said nervously. "Just share a little about what you did. People would love to hear it." Eleanor agreed, though the idea unsettled her. She had not traveled to inspire anyone. She had traveled to prove, quietly, to herself, that she was not finished yet. Still, she stood in front of a modest audience of retirees, church friends, and a few curious students. At first, she simply described the places she had been, showing them photos of temples and marketplaces, of streets that wound like mazes and sunrises over mountains that took her breath away. But as the questions began, "Did you manage alone? Weren't you afraid?" Eleanor found herself speaking about more than logistics. She spoke about the small humiliations of being dismissed as incapable, about the heavy weight of being told too old, as though it were a final verdict. She explained how each destination was less about the landmark and more about reclaiming pieces of herself that the world had tried to take. When she finished, the room was quiet, many eyes glassy with unspoken emotion. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then rising, a sound that felt warmer than any recognition she had ever sought. Afterward, people approached her with their own stories. A retired nurse admitted she had always wanted to see the Grand Canyon but thought it was too late. A young woman confessed she was scared to travel alone but felt braver knowing Eleanor had done it at 78. These conversations left Eleanor humbled. She had left to escape the cage of doubt others had built for her, and now she found herself holding keys for others. That night, she sat by her window watching the evening settle over her quiet street. The world was suddenly both larger and closer than ever before. She realized her journey wasn't over just because she was home. What she had sent her family, the postcards, the photographs, the stories, was only the beginning. The true gift was what had been sent back to her, proof that courage can be contagious, and that even one life lived with defiance against limitation could stir others into action. Eleanor folded the letters from strangers, into a box beside her travel mementos. Tomorrow she would write back to them, one by one, not to boast, not to encourage recklessly, but to say the simplest thing she had learned. The horizon does not close with age, it only waits for you to look up. Eleanor's days began to take on a new rhythm, one she hadn't anticipated. She had expected to slip quietly back into the routines of home life, reading by the window, tending to the modest garden behind her house, and sharing Sunday dinners with her children and grandchildren. Instead, she found herself receiving invitations almost weekly. Community groups, senior organizations, and even local schools reached out, asking if she might come and share her story. At first, she hesitated. She was no public speaker, and the thought of standing in front of strangers made her palms damp. But she had learned something in her travels. Fear was rarely as heavy as regret, and so she began to say yes. Her first school visit came on a grey afternoon in March. The auditorium buzzed with restless energy as 100 teenagers shuffled into their seats, skeptical of the elderly woman sitting on stage with her suitcase at her side. Eleanor wondered briefly if she had made a mistake, but when the principal introduced her and stepped back, she stood, placing her hand on the worn handle of the suitcase. "This," she said, tapping it lightly, "has been to more countries than most of you can name, and I took it there at 78 years old." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was enough to soften her nerves. She spoke not with rehearsed lines, but with stories. She told them about struggling with her suitcase on the steps of a train in Italy until a stranger offered a hand, about the fear of getting lost in a maze of streets in Morocco, only to discover that kindness could be found in the least expected alley. She admitted the moments of doubt, the nights she lay awake in a foreign hotel room, wondering if she was foolish to be there, but she balanced them with moments of triumph, like standing on the ancient stones of Machu Picchu. The students, who at first had leaned back with crossed arms, now leaned forward. One girl raised her hand and asked, "Weren't you scared?" Eleanor smiled. "Of course I was, but courage isn't about not being scared. It's about moving anyway, one step at a time, even if your knees ache while you do it." Laughter rippled through the room, warm and genuine. By the end, students were asking where she was going next, as though the answer were obvious that she must keep going somewhere. After the talk, a boy no older than 16 approached her quietly, waiting until the others had gone. "My grandma doesn't leave the house much anymore," he said. "She says people look right through her. Could I show her your story?" Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Of course you can," she told him, "and tell her she's not invisible, not unless she chooses to be." That evening, back at home, Eleanor thought about the boy's words. She realized her story had ceased to belong solely to her. It had become something larger, something passed from hand to hand, like a lantern in the dark, and that thought both humbled and emboldened her. It was her granddaughter who first suggested she start writing it all down. "You've got so many stories, Grandma," she insisted. "Not just for us, but for everyone. People need to hear them." Eleanor resisted at first, claiming she wasn't a writer, just a traveler with a stubborn streak. But the girl brought her a notebook anyway, placing it on the dining table with a pen tucked inside. "Start here," she said. Eleanor opened the notebook that night. The blank page stared back at her, daunting in its emptiness. Then she wrote the first line. "They told me I was too old to travel." The words came slowly at first, then more quickly, memories spilling onto the page as though they had been waiting for release. By midnight, she had filled 10 pages. When she finally closed the notebook, she felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of beginning rather than ending. Her journey around the world had ended. Yes, but another journey was just taking shape. And this one, she realized, might carry farther than any plane ever could. The notebook became her companion in the weeks that followed. It sat on the dining table by the window, open and waiting, a quiet invitation she could not ignore. At first, Eleanor wrote in bursts short entries, about a single moment in Rome or a conversation she had in a small cafe in Lisbon. She described the taste of saffron in Morocco, the silence of temples in Kyoto, the laughter of strangers on a night train through Germany. But as the days passed, her writing deepened. She began to weave not only the details of her journey, but the emotions beneath them, the tremors of doubt when she boarded her first flight, the ache of loneliness that sometimes crept in at night, and the profound joy that came when she realized she was capable of more than anyone had believed. Her daughter, curious, asked to read a few pages. Eleanor hesitated, but eventually agreed. One evening, after dinner, her daughter sat quietly with the notebook while Eleanor cleared dishes in the kitchen. When she returned, she found her daughter wiping her eyes. "Mom," she said softly, "this isn't just your story. This is every woman who's ever been told to sit down and stay put. You need to share this." Word spread quickly through their family. Soon her grandchildren were urging her to put the stories online. "People post everything these days." Grandma, her eldest grandson, insisted. "But your story, that's the kind of thing people actually want to read." With their help, she set up a simple blog. They taught her how to upload photos, how to copy her handwritten notes into digital text. The first entry went live on a quiet Saturday morning. "They said I was too old to travel, but I went anyway." To Eleanor's surprise, the response was immediate. Comments trickled in from strangers across the country. Some shared their own dreams of traveling, but confessed they had always been afraid. Others told her how they had stopped trying new things after a certain age, only to feel a spark reignited after reading her words. By the end of the first week, her story had been shared hundreds of times. A travel magazine reached out, asking if they could publish an excerpt. A local radio host invited her for an interview. Eleanor, who had once been told she was too old to even attempt travel, now found her words traveling farther than she ever had. The attention was overwhelming at times. She kept her routine simple: tea in the morning, an hour of writing, an afternoon walk through the neighborhood. Yet even on those walks, neighbors began stopping her to say they had read her blog. A retired teacher admitted it made her finally book a trip to visit her sister across the country. A man in his 50s told her he had signed up for an art class he had always been too embarrassed to try. Eleanor listened with quiet amazement, realizing her story had become a mirror in which others saw their own possibilities. One evening, as she sat typing a new entry about her visit to Machu Picchu, her phone buzzed with a message from her granddaughter. It contained a screenshot of a social media post. A group of women in their 70s, holding up passports and smiling into the camera, had tagged Eleanor's blog as their inspiration for planning a group trip to Greece. Beneath the photo they had written, "We thought we were finished. Turns out, we're just getting started." Eleanor stared at the screen, her heart swelling with pride and disbelief. It dawned on her then that what she had sent her family during her travels, postcards, souvenirs, photographs, had grown into something she was now sending the world. Not tokens, but reminders. That courage is not a gift of the young, but a choice available to anyone, at any age. That possibility does not expire. She closed the notebook that night with a deep sense of peace, knowing the journey she had thought was hers alone had become something far larger. And as she set the notebook aside, she realized the next chapter of her life was no longer about proving anything to herself. It was about giving others permission to begin. Summer arrived with an unexpected letter. The envelope bore no return address, only the neat black type of an official seal. Eleanor opened it at the dining table where her notebook usually lay. Inside was an invitation from a National Travel Association, congratulating her on being selected to receive their annual Lifetime Journey Award, an honor given to individuals who inspire others to see the world in new ways. For a moment, she laughed out loud, the sound startling even to herself. She had never won awards as a young woman, too busy raising children, too busy holding together what life had left her. And now, in her late 70s, the world had suddenly decided to notice. Her children were ecstatic, her grandchildren even more so. "Grandma, you're famous," one of them declared, holding up her phone to show Eleanor an article online. There was her picture-red scarf beneath the Eiffel Tower, accompanied by a headline that read, "She refused to stay home. At 78, she went everywhere." Eleanor shook her head in disbelief. "I didn't do this to be famous," she said. "I just wanted to go." But inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction, not for the recognition itself, but for the validation that her choice had meant something beyond herself. The award ceremony was to be held in New York City, a place Eleanor had visited once as a girl. Her family insisted on traveling with her this time, booking flights and hotel rooms so she would not be alone. When they arrived, the city felt almost overwhelming with its towering buildings and unceasing noise. But Eleanor moved through it with the calm assurance of someone who had navigated markets in Marrakesh and train stations in Tokyo. The evening of the ceremony, she dressed carefully in a navy gown her daughter had chosen, fastening around her neck the small silver necklace her husband had given her decades earlier. The ballroom was filled with travelers of all ages, young backpackers, seasoned explorers, photographers, writers. Eleanor felt a flicker of self-doubt as she rolled her suitcase to the registration table. Would they think she didn't belong here? But when the announcer called her name, the crowd erupted in applause. People rose to their feet as she approached the stage, a gesture that brought an unexpected lump to her throat. She accepted the award, a glass globe mounted on a wooden base, and stood at the microphone. The bright lights pressed against her eyes, but she spoke steadily. "When I began this journey," she said, "I was told I was too old, too fragile, too much of a risk. What I discovered is that the world doesn't care how old you are. The world waits for anyone willing to step into it. I didn't go looking for awards or recognition. I went because I refused to let fear or age decide what my life should look like. If my story has shown anything, let it be this: you are never too old to begin again." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause so loud she could feel it in her chest. Strangers approached afterward to shake her hand, some telling her she reminded them of their mothers or grandmothers, others confessing that they had given up dreams they might now reclaim. Eleanor listened to them all, humbled and slightly dazed, as though she had stepped into a life she never expected to inhabit. That night, back in the hotel, she placed the award carefully on the desk and sat beside it. Her children and grandchildren buzzed with excitement, already talking about what came next. But Eleanor simply looked out the window at the city lights, stretching endlessly across the horizon. She thought about the letter that had once told her she was too old, and about the postcards she had sent in defiance. Now, in her hands, she held proof that her choice to keep going had echoed farther than she could have imagined. She didn't need the glass globe to tell her she had been right, but she smiled as she touched it, whispering softly to herself, "And to think they almost convinced me to stay home." The award ceremony might have felt like a conclusion to some, but for Eleanor it was only another doorway. When she returned home, the glass globe sat on her mantelpiece, reflecting the soft afternoon light. Visitors would pause to admire it, but Eleanor never lingered on it for long. She considered it less a trophy and more a reminder. Life had chapters left to be written, and she was still holding the pen. Not long after her return, she received a phone call that surprised her more than the award itself. A publisher inquired about her blog, which by now had attracted a modest but devoted following. "Mrs. Callahan," the editor said in a warm, deliberate tone, "we believe your story could reach even more people in book form. Would you consider writing a memoir?" Eleanor nearly laughed, not out of dismissal but out of disbelief. A book. She had spent years cataloguing others' words in her bookshop, never imagining her own would fill pages bound for a library shelf. But after a moment of quiet, she heard herself say yes. The project consumed her days. Morning sunlight found her bent over the dining table, stacks of notebooks spread around her, photos clipped with paper clips to mark each chapter of her journey. She wrote not only about the countries she had visited, but about the decades before raising children, the loneliness of widowhood, the endless repetition of being told no. For the first time, she began to see her life not as scattered events, but as a continuous thread woven with resilience. Her granddaughter often joined her, acting as a typist for the rougher days when Eleanor's hands tired from holding the pen. Together they shaped the narrative, and in the process, Eleanor felt the closeness of family deepen. Her granddaughter confessed that reading the drafts made her reconsider her own future. "I've been afraid to take risks," she admitted one evening. "But you show me that risks don't disappear just because you get older. They're always waiting." Eleanor reached across the table, touching her hand, "And so are the rewards." Months later, the manuscript was complete. When Eleanor held the printed proof in her hands for the first time, she ran her fingers over the embossed title, "Not Too Old, Journeys of a Reluctant Adventurer." She chuckled at the subtitle. It was her editor's idea, but the words rang true. She had not set out to be brave or to prove anyone wrong. She had set out simply because she refused to let fear dictate her choices. The book's release was modest, but its impact was not. Local libraries organized readings, where Eleanor sat at a small table and signed copies for people who brought not only books, but their own stories. Some were elderly women who whispered confessions about dreams they had quietly abandoned. Others were young parents who wanted to show their children that age did not define possibility. Each signature Eleanor wrote felt less like her name and more like a small encouragement. sent out into the world. One evening after a reading, a man approached her with trembling hands holding a copy of her book. "I lost my wife last year," he said, his voice catching. "I haven't stepped outside my routine since. But your words, they reminded me that I still have places left to see. She would want me to go." Eleanor clasped his hand gently, meeting his eyes. "Then go," she told him. "For her, for yourself. The world is still waiting." As she left that night, Eleanor realized her journey had taken on a new shape. It was no longer only about her travels, but about sparking others into motion. The postcards she had once sent were now transformed into something greater. Chapters of a book carried into homes she would never visit, lives she would never meet, and in that quiet knowledge, she felt the rarest kind of satisfaction, that her story, once dismissed, now had the power to help others begin their own. The first box of her books arrived on the porch one breezy autumn morning. Eleanor bent carefully to pick it up, surprised at how heavy it felt, though she knew it wasn't just the weight of paper. Inside were stories of her life bound neatly into covers, each page carrying the footsteps of her journey. She carried the box into the living room and opened it with her grandson's pocketknife, slicing through the tape with deliberate care. The scent of fresh ink rose up, sharp and new, contrasting against the old photographs on her mantel. She lifted the top copy and held it close, marveling that the life she had once been told was too small, too finished, now existed in a form that others could carry with them. That afternoon, her daughter arrived unexpectedly with two friends in tow. They had stopped at the local bookstore on Main Street and found Eleanor's memoir displayed near the front window. "You're right next to the travel guides," her daughter said with a laugh. "I think you've officially joined their ranks." Eleanor smiled, though a part of her still couldn't quite believe it. For years, she had shelved other authors' works in her little shop, never imagining her name would one day sit on a spine among them. As the weeks went by, the book spread beyond her town. She began receiving messages from readers across the country, some from people in their 70s and 80s, who said they had bought new suitcases because of her. One woman wrote from Arizona, saying she had taken her first solo trip to a national park after reading Eleanor's words. A man from Maine sent a photo of himself on a fishing boat, explaining that he had been afraid to leave home since his retirement, but had finally decided to take a trip. He'd always dreamed of. These stories arrived like ripples, each one reminding Eleanor that her decision to move forward had created waves larger than she ever intended. Her grandchildren were especially fascinated. They watched as strangers stopped her in the grocery store to thank her, or when letters from abroad slipped into the mailbox alongside bills. "Grandma," one of them asked during a Sunday dinner, "did you ever think this would happen?" Eleanor shook her head, cutting her food slowly before answering. "No," she said. "All I thought was that I didn't want to sit quietly while the world kept moving without me. I didn't expect anyone to notice." Her grandson grinned. "Well, everyone noticed." An invitation arrived in late October that tested her resolve again. A conference in Chicago focused on aging and independence wanted her to deliver the keynote address. The idea of standing before a hall of professionals and policymakers felt daunting. She was used to small gatherings, libraries and schools, not stages with microphones and spotlights. For a day she considered declining. But then she remembered the boy who had asked if he could share her story with his grandmother, the man who said his wife would have wanted him to travel, and the women who had booked a trip to Greece after reading her blog. If she could stand for them, she told herself, she could stand for anyone. The conference hall was vast, rows of chairs stretching far back, filled with faces that turned as she was introduced. Eleanor carried no notes. She stood at the podium, with her book in her hands, speaking not as an expert, but as a witness. She told them what it felt like to be told you were too old, how it stung and how it lingered, how the world's quiet dismissal could be heavier than any suitcase. And then she told them what it felt like to go anyway, to see, to walk, to stumble, to rise. The room grew quiet as her voice carried, and by the time she finished, people were standing once again. A gesture she was slowly beginning to recognize. That evening, alone in her hotel room, Eleanor placed the award from the ceremony beside her book on the nightstand. The objects gleamed under the lamp, but she knew neither truly defined her. What mattered were the lives now in motion, the journeys unfolding because hers had, and in that stillness, she understood something deeper. Her story was no longer just about proving age wrong. It was about showing the world that every season of life still holds a horizon worth chasing. Winter settled in with its quiet insistence, snow frosting the roofs of Eleanor's town and softening the streets she had walked. For decades, she spent the season mostly indoors, her days divided between answering letters from readers and continuing to write in her notebook. The book's success had drawn more attention than she expected, and while she tried to keep her life simple, she found herself pulled gently into a wider circle. She didn't mind it. In fact, the conversations that blossomed out of her story seemed to keep her warm, even as the cold crept into the windows. One afternoon in January, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made her pick up. On the other end was a woman introducing herself as the coordinator of a non-profit that organized intergenerational travel programs. "We pair older adults with young people for cultural exchange trips," the woman explained. "Many of our participants are seniors who've been told their traveling days are over. When we read your story, we thought you're exactly the voice we need." Eleanor listened quietly, surprised by the request. They wanted her to lead a trip to Spain, acting as both traveler and mentor to a group of students who had never left the country before. She hesitated. It was one thing to travel alone, guided only by her own choices. It was another to carry the responsibility of others, especially young people full of expectation. But the woman's voice was gentle and persuasive. "They need someone to show them that adventure has no age limit. You've already done it yourself. Why not help them begin?" Eleanor thought of her granddaughter urging her to write, of the boy at the school who wanted to show her story to his grandmother. She found herself saying yes. Preparations began almost immediately. The non-profit mailed her an itinerary, complete with workshops and activities planned in Madrid, Seville, and Barcelona. Eleanor reviewed it with care, jotting notes in the margins. Her family worried at first. "It's one thing to travel alone, Mum," her daughter said, "but what if the kids are too much? What if it wears you out?" Eleanor smiled. "Then it wears me out. I'd rather be tired from living than rested from sitting still." When the trip began in March, Eleanor met the group at the airport. 10 teenagers, buzzing with nervous energy, stood with backpacks slung over their shoulders. They eyed her with curiosity, this silver-haired woman who was supposed to be their guide. Eleanor greeted them with a smile. "Don't worry," she told them. "I'm not here to tell you where to go. I'm here to show you what happens when you step out into the world." Spain unfolded like a vivid tapestry before them. Eleanor watched as the students marveled at the soaring arches of cathedrals, stumbled over their first attempts at Spanish in crowded markets, and laughed together over shared plates of food. She moved at her own pace, slower at times, but the young people adjusted naturally, waiting for her, including her in their adventures without hesitation. One evening in Seville, as they sat in a plaza listening to street musicians, one of the girls turned to her and said, "I didn't know older people could travel like this. My grandma says she's too old." Eleanor smiled gently. "Tell her she's not too old. Tell her she's just in a different chapter." By the end of the trip, the students had begun calling her Abuela Eleanor, a title that made her both laugh and swell with pride. On the flight home, she reflected on what had happened. She had set out to prove her own life wasn't finished, but in Spain she had seen the spark pass into others. Her courage had stretched across generations, reminding both the young and the old that the world waits for no one, but it welcomes anyone willing to step forward. When she returned, she wrote in her notebook once more, "The journey continues, not because of where I go, but because of who goes after me." The spring after her trip to Spain, Eleanor noticed something different about the way people in her town looked at her. It wasn't just the polite nods at the grocery store anymore, or the smiles from neighbors when she passed on her afternoon walks. There was a new weight in their eyes, a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. She had lived in the same neighborhood for 40 years, and yet only now did she feel truly seen. It became clear one morning when the town librarian called Mrs. Callahan. She began, her voice tinged with excitement. "We're starting a community program to encourage people to write their own life stories. We'd love for you to be our first speaker." Eleanor felt her breath catch. She had always loved libraries, the quiet hum of them, the way shelves held lives between covers. To be asked to speak there felt like a full-circle moment. She agreed without hesitation. On the evening of the event, the library's modest meeting room was packed. Rows of folding chairs had been set out, but people stood along the walls too. Eleanor arrived with her notebook in hand, the same one she had filled with her travel entries, though now its pages were soft from being turned so often. She sat at the front while the librarian introduced her, calling her an inspiration to our community. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably at the word but rose to her feet anyway. She began with honesty. "I never thought I'd be standing here. For years, I believed my story wasn't big enough, not exciting enough, not important enough. Then one day, I realized the size of the story doesn't matter. What matters is whether you choose to live it." She spoke about writing her memoir, about the blank pages that had frightened her at first, and how slowly filling them had shown her the value of her own experiences. "We all have a book inside us," she told the room, "but some of us leave it unwritten. I don't want you to make that mistake." People nodded, some scribbling notes, others simply staring at her with quiet intensity. Afterward, questions flowed. A retired teacher asked how to begin writing about her childhood. A middle-aged man wondered if it was too late to share his father's war stories. Eleanor answered as best she could, not as an expert, but as someone who had learned that beginnings only required the courage to put down the first word at the end. A young mother approached her, balancing a toddler on her hip. "I don't have time to write now," she said apologetically, "but hearing you makes me want to start keeping a journal, just so my daughter knows who I am one day." Eleanor reached out, touched her hand, and said, "That's exactly the kind of beginning I was talking about." The library event sparked something larger. Soon, Eleanor was invited to lead small workshops where she guided others through exercises in memory and storytelling. She wasn't teaching so much as reminding people that their lives held meaning, that every ordinary detail could matter if they chose to preserve it. She watched with pride as people who had once dismissed themselves as unremarkable began to write pages filled with laughter, loss, joy, and resilience. One evening, after a particularly full workshop, Eleanor returned home to find an email from a man in another state. He had read her memoir and attended one of her online talks. "You've convinced me to take the trip I've been putting off for 30 years, he wrote. "I'm leaving next month to finally see the place where my grandparents were born. Thank you for reminding me it isn't too late." Eleanor closed her laptop slowly, her eyes misting over. She realized then that what had started as her journey was no longer hers alone. As spring deepened into summer, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose she had not known in years. She had once been told she was too old to travel. Now she was helping others travel into their own pasts, their own stories, their own possibilities, and in that work, she discovered something profound. Sometimes the greatest journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the courage to finally give your own life a voice. By summer's end, Eleanor's calendar was fuller than it had ever been, a mix of workshops, library talks, and the occasional radio interview. Yet, even as her words carried into new places, she found herself craving the quiet she once thought would define her retirement. One afternoon, she packed a small bag and drove out to the coast, to a cottage she had rented for a week. The sea had always steadied her, the rhythm of the waves a reminder that life's tides never truly stopped, only shifted. The cottage was simple whitewashed walls, creaky floorboards, windows that framed the horizon like paintings that changed every hour. Eleanor set her suitcase by the bed and opened the shutters to let in the smell of salt and seaweed. She had come not to write or to plan, but to sit still. And yet, on the second evening, she found herself pulling her notebook from her bag, the habit too ingrained now to ignore. She wrote about the sea, about the gulls swooping low, about the way the horizon stretched further than the eye could follow. Then, unexpectedly, she began writing about her late husband. She hadn't written much of him in her memoir: his illness, his slow decline, the years when travel had been a luxury they couldn't imagine. But here, with the waves crashing outside, she allowed herself to put down what she had long kept silent, the grief that had shaped her, and the resilience it had forced her to build. The words came haltingly, but once they were on the page, Eleanor felt lighter. She realized her travels had not only been about proving the world wrong, they had been her way of making peace with all that she had lost. For so long, she had carried the quiet fear that life had ended when his did. But in her suitcase, in her steps across unfamiliar cities, in the faces of strangers who became friends, she had rediscovered life's stubborn persistence. Midweek, her family came to visit. Her daughter arrived with 2 of the grandchildren, their laughter filling the cottage like sunlight. They spent the day on the beach, building uneven sandcastles and chasing the tide. That evening, as the sky burned orange and pink, Eleanor's daughter turned to her. "Mum," she said softly, "I think you've become a different person since you started all this." Eleanor shook her head. "Not different. Just more myself than I've been in years." Later, after they left, she thought about that exchange. Perhaps that was the heart of it. She had not set out to change, only to live. And yet, in doing so, she had uncovered layers of herself she thought were long gone. The fearless girl who once dreamed of faraway places. The stubborn mother who refused to let hardship break her. The older woman who still believed in possibility. On her last night at the cottage, Eleanor walked down to the water's edge with her notebook tucked under her arm. She sat on a driftwood log and watched the moon lay a silver path across the sea. She opened to a blank page and wrote one line. "The journey doesn't end with each, it deepens." She closed the book gently, letting the sentence rest there, unpolished but true. When she returned home, she carried the calm of the sea with her. The noise of invitations and attention no longer overwhelmed her, because she understood now that she could step away when she needed to. She didn't have to chase significance, it had already found her. And as she placed the notebook back on her table, she realized she was no longer only telling her story. She was living a new one in which every chapter, however ordinary, still mattered. Autumn returned with its gold and rust-colored leaves, and with it came an unexpected letter that made Eleanor pause. It was from a university in the city, inviting her to speak at a lecture series on aging and resilience. She had spoken in libraries and community centers, but a university auditorium, filled with students and professors, felt different. She reread the letter twice, wondering if they had mistaken her for someone else. Yet at the bottom was her name, handwritten by the program director with a note. "Your story matters. Please share it with our students." "Jat," she agreed, though the thought of standing at a lectern in front of hundreds made her stomach flutter. When the day came, she dressed simply navy slacks, a cream blouse, and the silver necklace she always wore when she needed courage. Her granddaughter drove her to the campus, where students hurried across wide walkways lined with trees. Eleanor felt strangely small, as though she had stepped back in time to her own college days, long before marriage, children, and the weight of responsibility had settled over her life. The lecture hall buzzed with chatter as she was introduced. She stood at the front, her notes tucked into her notebook, though she didn't plan to use them much. When the applause faded, she looked out at the faces before her, some curious, some distracted, a few skeptical. She cleared her throat and began. "They told me I was too old to travel," she said plainly. A ripple of laughter and surprise moved through the crowd, and maybe I believed them for a while. But one day, I decided to go anyway. She told them about the letter from the travel agency that dismissed her, about the decision to pack her old suitcase, about the postcards she sent from every country. She described standing at Machu Picchu, her knees aching but her spirit soaring, and how strangers in Morocco or Japan or Italy had reminded her that kindness had no language barrier. The students leaned in. Eleanor could see them listening differently than adults usually did. For them, age was a distant concept, something that belonged to parents or grandparents. She wanted them to understand that time passed quickly and that waiting too long to live often left people with regret. "Don't think you have endless years to start living your dreams," she told them. "And don't think age takes them away. The only thing that takes them is fear." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. During the Q&A, a young man raised his hand and asked, "Do you ever wish you had started earlier?" Eleanor considered carefully before answering. "No," she said finally. "If I had gone when I was young, I might not have appreciated it in the same way. Sometimes the timing that feels late is exactly right, because when you go later, you carry every chapter of your life with you, and that makes the journey richer." Afterward, students gathered around her, asking questions, wanting to take photos, even requesting autographs in their notebooks. One young woman hugged her and whispered, "You make me want to call my grandma and ask her about her life." Eleanor's throat tightened. That, she thought, was worth more than any award. On the drive home, her granddaughter beamed. "You were amazing, Grandma. You didn't just talk about travel, you made them think about their own lives." Eleanor smiled faintly, watching the autumn fields roll past the window. "That's all I ever wanted. Not to be seen as extraordinary, but to remind people they still can be." That evening, as she set her notebook back on the table, Eleanor added another line beneath her last entry. "Every story told can awaken another." That is how journeys continue, even when your suitcase is finally set down. Winter came early that year, laying a sheet of frost over the sidewalks and painting the trees in glassy white. Eleanor sat by her window, watching her breath fog against the cold pane, and wondered how far her story had traveled by now. Letters still came, sometimes from across the country, sometimes from across the ocean. Each envelope reminded her that her journey had reached places she had never set foot in. But what arrived that December was unlike anything she had seen before. The package was small, wrapped in brown paper with foreign stamps scattered across the surface. She opened it carefully, revealing a hand-bound journal filled with signatures, photographs, and short notes. A group of women in their 70s from Greece had compiled it. In the first entry, one of them wrote, "We read your book and decided to go where we had always dreamed. This is our journey because of you." Page after page showed them in front of the Parthenon, standing by the sea, laughing together in cafes. Eleanor pressed her hand to the page, her eyes stinging with tears. She had sent postcards to her family, but now, strangers were sending postcards back to her, proof that the spark she lit had become a flame in others. That week, she shared the journal with her family over dinner. Her grandchildren flipped through the pages in awe, exclaiming at the photos and stories. "You've started something, Grandma," her grandson said quietly. "It's like a chain reaction. You showed them it wasn't too late, and now they're showing others." Eleanor listened, humbled. She had never thought of herself as the beginning of anything. But perhaps, she realized, beginnings often looked that way, small acts that grew once passed along. News of the journal spread. The local newspaper printed an article about it, calling Eleanor the grandmother of inspiration. The title made her laugh, but soon she began receiving more packages, journals, photos, letters from groups around the world who had taken journeys in her honor. Some were simple trips to nearby cities, others were once-in-a-lifetime voyages overseas. Each one carried the same message: because you went, we went to. In January, Eleanor was invited to display the collection at the town's cultural center. She agreed, and on the evening of the opening, she walked slowly through the exhibit, her hand brushing over the glass cases where the journals and photos were displayed. People from town wandered in, marveling at how far her influence had traveled. A woman leaned close and whispered, "I've lived here my whole life, and I never thought I could leave. But seeing this, maybe I can." Eleanor turned to her and said simply, "You can." The exhibit became a gathering place for stories. People brought their own photos and notes, pinning them to a growing board labeled "Journeys Yet to Come." Eleanor visited often, sometimes just to sit quietly and listen. She found joy in hearing others speak of their dreams aloud, as though they had been waiting for permission. She realized she was no longer just sharing her own journey. She was curating a space where others could claim theirs. One evening, after the cultural center closed, Eleanor lingered alone in the hall. The cases glowed softly under the lights, and the board of pinned dreams rustled as the heater clicked on. She stood there with her coat draped over her arm, struck by the thought that the girl who once sat at her dining table, told she was too old, could never have imagined this room. The postcards she had once sent had multiplied into hundreds of stories, carried by people she would never meet. When she left, snowflakes fell gently onto the quiet street. Eleanor pulled her scarf tighter and whispered into the night, "The journey isn't mine anymore. It belongs to all of us." And for the first time, she understood that her greatest adventure might not be the places she had gone, but the lives she had helped set into motion. The new year brought with it an invitation Eleanor could never have expected. One cold February morning, as she stirred sugar into her tea, the phone rang. On the line was a representative from a national television network. They were producing a special series on ordinary people, extraordinary journeys, and they wanted her to be one of the featured guests. Eleanor nearly dropped her spoon into her cup. She had grown used to letters, workshops, even newspaper articles. But television felt like an entirely different world. Her first instinct was to refuse. "I'm not someone who belongs on television," she told her daughter later that afternoon. "I'm just me, a woman who packed a suitcase and went." But her daughter only smiled, shaking her head. "That's exactly why they want you, because you're not trying to be anything more than who you are. People need to see that." So she agreed. The filming was scheduled for March, in a studio several hours away. The crew arrived at her house first to capture footage of her in her everyday life. Eleanor found herself laughing as she made tea under the bright lights they had set up in her kitchen, her movements suddenly self-conscious under the gaze of the camera. The director reassured her gently, "Just be yourself, that's all people want to see." There they interviewed her in the living room, the mantel with its globe-shaped award and photographs providing the backdrop. They asked her about the moment she received the letter that dismissed her as too old, about what it felt like to stand under the Eiffel Tower for the first time, about the postcards she had sent home. Eleanor spoke, as she always did, honestly, without embellishment. At one point, the interviewer asked, "What was the hardest part?" She paused before answering, "Believing I deserved to go, that I wasn't finished. Once I got past that, the rest was just walking forward." The segment aired 2 weeks later. Eleanor sat in her living room surrounded by her family, her grandchildren curled up on the floor in front of the television. She expected to feel embarrassed, but instead she felt strangely calm as she watched her own face on the screen. She looked older than she felt inside, but she also looked steady, grounded. The producers had woven her words with images of her travels and even included excerpts from the journals and postcards others had sent her. By the time the segment ended, her family was in tears. Her granddaughter hugged her tightly. "Grandma, everyone is going to see how incredible you are." Eleanor smiled softly. Not incredible, just willing. The response was overwhelming. Strangers began recognizing her in grocery stores and on the street. Letters poured in at a rate she had never experienced before, dozens in a single week. Some were from people her age who said they had booked their first trip in years. Others were from young viewers who admitted they had never thought about growing old until they saw her. "You make me think of my grandmother differently," one college student wrote. "I didn't realize she still had dreams." At first, the attention felt surreal, almost too much. But then Eleanor realized it wasn't about her face on the screen, it was about what she represented. She was not a celebrity, she was a mirror. People saw themselves in her, the fears they carried, the excuses they repeated, and the possibilities they had quietly buried. One evening, after a long day of responding to messages, Eleanor wrote a new entry in her notebook. "The world called me too old. Now it calls me brave. But the truth is simpler. I was just tired of sitting still." She closed the notebook with a small smile, knowing her story was no longer just hers to keep. It had become a kind of lantern, and everywhere it was carried, more people were finding the courage to light their own. The weeks following her television appearance blurred into a series of phone calls, letters, and unexpected invitations. Eleanor had never thought of herself as busy in her later years, but now her days brimmed with commitments. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a conference in Washington, D.C., focused on public policy and the aging population. The idea startled her. What could she offer to politicians and policymakers? But the organizer insisted. "Mrs. Callahan, your story puts a human face on what we're trying to address. People need to see more than numbers on a page. They need to see you." She agreed, though quietly she wondered if she had wandered into a life too big for her. When the day of the conference arrived, she found herself standing in a grand hall with chandeliers glittering above and rows of suited attendees, murmuring over their programs. At the front of the room, a long table of lawmakers sat waiting. Eleanor clutched her notes, her palms damp, but when she walked to the podium, the room quieted. She began not with statistics, but with a story. She told them about the letter that had tried to confine her, about the decision to pack her suitcase, about standing on ancient stones while strangers in faraway countries reminded her of her own strength. She spoke about the journals sent to her from Greece and beyond, each one proof that inspiration could ripple outward. "We talk about aging as though it's an ending," she said, her voice steady. "But what if it's another kind of beginning? What if the real problem isn't age, but the walls we build around it?" The room remained still. She saw pens pause mid-scribble, heads tilt slightly forward, even the lawmakers shifting in their chairs to listen. She did not lecture them on policy, she simply described the lived truth of being told you are too old, and the liberation of refusing to believe it. When she finished, the applause was not thunderous, but it was long and genuine, echoing off the tall walls in a way that felt heavier than any ovation she had ever received. Afterward, the senator approached her privately. He was a tall man with grey hair and a tired expression, but his handshake was firm. "My mother is 83, he told her. "She used to paint, but stopped years ago because she thought no one cared. I think I'm going to buy her brushes again." Eleanor smiled, touched by the simplicity of his words. She realized then that her role was not to provide answers, but to remind others of possibilities. That evening, as she returned to her hotel, Eleanor stood by the window overlooking the Capitol dome. The city lights stretched across the horizon, and for the first time she grasped the full scale of what her story had become. It had begun at her dining table, with maps spread across the wood and a suitcase waiting by her chair. Now it was here, woven into conversations that might change laws, reshape programs, or simply restore forgotten hope. When she returned home, she sat once again at her dining table, the familiar comfort of her notebook before her. She wrote slowly, choosing her words with care. I thought my journey was about travel, but it seems it was always about something large, about reminding people that age is not a locked door. It is an open gate, if you dare to step through. She closed the notebook, feeling the weight of what she had written. Outside, the world moved on as always, but inside her heart, she sensed something had shifted again. She had not set out to be a symbol, yet somehow she had become one, and as she looked at her worn suitcase resting in the corner, she wondered not if her travels were finished, but where they might carry her next. The following spring, Eleanor received a letter that touched her more deeply than any invitation or award. It was written in looping, uneven handwriting on yellow stationery, and signed simply, Margaret, age 92. The letter explained that Margaret had lived in the same small town her entire life, never traveling farther than the county fair 2 towns over. She had read Eleanor's memoir in the library, and for the first time in decades felt a pull toward something new. I don't want to die without seeing the ocean, Margaret confessed, but everyone tells me it's impossible now. Late too much. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it gently. She remembered the sting of being told she was too old, and she knew she couldn't let Margaret's words end that way. She picked up her pen and wrote back, her message, simple but firm. It's never too late to see the ocean. I'll help you if you want to go. Margaret's reply came quickly. Yes, she wanted to go. Yes, she was afraid. Yes, her family thought it was foolish, but she wanted to try. Eleanor called her daughter that night, explaining what she planned. Mom, her daughter said gently, are you sure? This is a lot for you to take on. Eleanor smiled softly into the phone. I know, but I think sometimes the journey isn't ours to take alone. Sometimes it's meant to be shared. So, she made the arrangements. A modest road trip, a rented van, a carefully planned route with rest stops and accommodations along the way. Margaret's family, though hesitant, eventually agreed when they saw how determined both women were. On a cool morning in May, Eleanor stood on Margaret's porch, suitcase in hand. Margaret shuffled out slowly with her walker, her eyes shining, with a mixture of fear and excitement. I can't believe I'm really doing this, she whispered. Eleanor reached for her hand. Believe it, we're going. The drive took 2 days, winding through fields and small towns, past rivers and rolling hills. Along the way, they shared stories of childhood spent in simpler times, of raising children, of husbands lost too soon. They laughed at their mistakes, reading road signs, and grew quiet when the memories grew heavy. In those hours, a bond formed that felt both new and timeless, as though their lives had been waiting to meet at this moment. When they finally reached the coast, the air shifted, salty and damp, carrying the cry of gulls. Margaret grew silent, staring out the window as the horizon opened before her. Eleanor parked near the boardwalk and helped her out of the van. The two women walked slowly toward the sand, Eleanor supporting Margaret's arm. When they reached the shore, Margaret stopped. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, its waves rolling in with steady power. Tears filled her eyes. I thought I'd never see this, she said, her voice breaking. Eleanor squeezed her hand. And now you have. Margaret bent to touch the wet sand with her fingertips, as if to prove it was real. For nearly an hour, they stood there together, saying little, listening to the rhythm of the tide. The ocean seemed to speak for them both, a reminder that some dreams wait patiently until we are ready. That evening, they sat on the balcony of their seaside inn, wrapped in blankets, watching the sunset paint the water gold. Margaret turned to Eleanor and whispered, "You gave this to me." Eleanor shook her head gently. "No, you gave it to yourself. You just needed someone to remind you it wasn't too late." When they returned home, Margaret's family greeted her with awe. She showed them seashells she had collected, holding them like treasures. Eleanor watched quietly, her heart swelling. She had thought her own journey was enough, but now she understood something deeper. Sometimes the greatest adventure was helping someone else reach theirs. The story of Eleanor and Margaret's ocean trip spread quickly through their town. What had begun as a quiet promise between two women became a tale retold at church gatherings, neighborhood dinners, and even the local newspaper. The headline read, "At 78 and 92, they prove it's never too late." Eleanor laughed when she saw it, but Margaret kept the clipping neatly folded in her purse, showing it proudly to anyone who asked. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor noticed something unusual. Neighbors who had once kept their dreams tucked away began speaking them aloud. A widower on her street mentioned he had always wanted to visit the baseball stadium where his father once took him as a boy. A retired nurse confessed she had dreamed of finishing her degree but thought it foolish at her age. Even Eleanor's own daughter, who had spent years cautioning her to slow down, admitted she sometimes wondered what it would be like to go back to school for art. Eleanor listened to them all, realizing that the journey she had begun had become contagious. One evening, the town's cultural center invited her to host a gathering called Dreams in Motion. The idea was simple, an open forum where people could share one dream they had set aside and discuss how they might pursue it now. Eleanor agreed, unsure of what to expect. When the night arrived, she walked into the hall to find it full far more than she had imagined. Folding chairs lined the room, and people stood along the back wall. Murmuring nervously, she began with her own story, as she always did. She told them about the letter that had called her too old, about the postcards, about Margaret's face, the moment she first saw the ocean. Then she asked the room, "What dreams have you put away? And what would it mean to take them out again?" At first, the silence was heavy, but then, slowly, a hand rose. It was the widower from her street. "I want to go see a game at Fenway Park," he said. The crowd nodded, some smiling. Another hand went up, an older woman with trembling fingers. "I've always wanted to learn to play piano." One by one, the voices came. A man who wanted to hike a trail he'd once walked in his 20s. A woman who dreamed of painting landscapes. Even a teenager spoke up, saying she wanted to travel abroad but feared disappointing her family. The room filled with a kind of energy Eleanor had felt before, the same ripple she had seen in Spain with the students, the same spark that had carried Margaret to the ocean. By the end of the night, a list had formed on a large sheet of paper. At the front of the room, dozens of dreams written in shaky handwriting and bold strokes alike. Eleanor looked at it and felt tears prick her eyes. "This," she told them softly, "is proof. Proof that it's never too late, and never too early either." The gathering became a monthly event. People began holding each other accountable, checking in on progress, sharing small victories. The widower made it to Boston, proudly displaying his ticket stub. The retired nurse enrolled in a class at the community college. The young teenager applied for a study abroad program. Eleanor attended every meeting, offering encouragement, but more importantly, listening. One night, as the group dispersed, a man approached her. He looked younger than most, maybe in his 50s, but his voice carried the weight of weariness. "I don't have a dream anymore," he admitted. "I lost it a long time ago." Eleanor looked at him steadily, then placed her hand on his arm. "Then borrow one of mine until you find yours. The world has more than enough to share." Walking home afterward, she thought about those words. She realized that what had started as her personal rebellion against age had grown into a movement of sorts. Though she would never call it that, it wasn't about her at all anymore. It was about possibility, the collective courage of people who dared to begin again. And as she closed her door that night, she knew her journey was still unfolding, now carried by every voice in that crowded hall. By early spring, Eleanor's town had changed in ways she could hardly have imagined. The Dreams in Motion gatherings had grown so popular that the cultural center had to move them into the town hall. What started as a handful of neighbors timidly sharing their hopes had turned into a crowd of over 100. Spilling into the aisles and standing along the back, people came not only from their town but from nearby cities, each carrying something they had long buried and now dared to speak aloud. Eleanor sat quietly at the front, notebook balanced on her lap, watching with awe as voices lifted one after another. She never saw herself as the leader of it all. She thought of herself as a witness, a gentle nudge reminding others that they were not finished yet. But to the community, she was more than that. She was proof. They began calling her the Keeper of Second Chances, a title that embarrassed her but also warmed her. Wherever she went, the grocery store, the post office, Even her evening walks people stopped her to share progress on their goals. One woman pulled a paintbrush from her bag and showed her the tiny canvas she carried everywhere. A man showed her photos of the hiking trail he had finally returned to after 20 years. Children waved at her in the street, shouting, "Where are you going next, Mrs. Callahan?" One day, she received a letter from the mayor's office. He invited her to a meeting at town hall, where she found herself seated across from a small committee. "Mrs. Callahan," the mayor began, "your story has brought more life into this town than anything we've seen in years. We'd like to honor that with a new initiative, one that encourages residents of all ages to pursue long-held dreams, and we'd like you to be the face of it." Eleanor blinked, stunned. "The face?" she asked. The mayor smiled. "You've already inspired it. We just want to give it structure." The initiative launched a month later under the name Horizons. Posters went up across town featuring Eleanor's photograph, not the posed kind, but a candid one of her laughing in her red scarf beneath the Eiffel Tower. The slogan read, "It's never too late. It's never too early." The program paired younger residents with older ones, encouraging them to learn from each other while chasing new experiences. A retired carpenter taught high schoolers how to build furniture. A young student helped an 80-year-old woman set up her first email account so she could write to her grandchildren overseas. The town buzzed with activity, and Eleanor often found herself moved to tears just watching it unfold. At the first official Horizons event, the hall was filled with pairs of people chatting, sketching plans, and laughing together. Eleanor walked slowly between the tables, her cane tapping lightly against the floor, listening to their stories. A man in his 70s told her he was finally learning Italian from a college student. A shy young woman explained she was writing her first novel with encouragement from her retired English teacher. Each voice added to the chorus of possibility, and Eleanor felt her chest swell with a pride that had nothing to do with herself, and everything to do with what the community had become. That evening, as she sat at home by her window, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Dreams are not possessions, they are seeds. When you plant one, others will bloom in places you cannot predict." She set her pen down, gazing out at the quiet street, and realized the town itself had become a garden one she had unknowingly helped tend. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt she had not only lived her own story, but had become part of something larger, something that would last long after her suitcase was finally put away. And in that knowledge, she found a peace deeper than any journey could give. As spring warmed into summer, Eleanor began noticing how her name traveled farther than she ever did. Articles appeared in regional papers, then national ones, each retelling her story in slightly different ways. The woman who proved age is only a number. The grandmother who sparked a movement, from postcards to possibility. She read them with quiet disbelief, often setting the paper aside to make her tea as though the headlines belonged to someone else. One morning, however, a letter arrived that made the headlines feel real. It bore the letterhead of a large foundation, known for funding educational and cultural programs. The director's note was brief but astonishing. They wanted to establish a traveling exhibition inspired by her life and the Horizons initiative. The exhibit would feature her postcards, photographs, Margaret's seashells from the ocean, and the journals sent by strangers around the world. More than that, it would invite visitors to leave behind their own stories and unfulfilled dreams. The exhibition would tour libraries, schools, and community centers across the country. "We believe your story has become a vessel," the letter read. "We want to carry it farther." Eleanor sat at her dining table, the letter trembling in her hand. She thought of the night she had first laid out her old maps, dismissed by a travel agency and doubted even by her own family. She had set out simply to see the world once before it was too late. Now, somehow, the world seemed determined to see her. Preparations moved quickly. A team of curators visited her home, carefully, photographing her journals and selecting artifacts to display. Eleanor watched as they packed her postcards into protective sleeves, treating them like treasures. "They're just notes I sent home," she said modestly. One curator smiled. "Yes, but together, they tell a story no one else could." The exhibition opened in the state capitol that autumn. The cultural center had transformed into a gallery filled with glass cases, maps pinned to walls, and a long wooden table covered in blank cards where visitors could write their own dream notes. Eleanor attended the opening night, her red scarf looped around her neck. Crowds filled the hall, walking slowly through her memories as though they were sacred. She stood quietly near the back, listening as people reacted. "This is my grandmother's story too," a young woman whispered to her friend. "Can you imagine, starting at her age?" An older man said, shaking his head in awe. When visitors reached the table of blank cards, many paused thoughtfully before writing. By the end of the evening, hundreds of notes hung from strings across the wall, dreams waiting to be lived. Some read, "Climb the mountain I see every morning," "Learn to dance before my daughter's wedding," "Write the book my father never finished." Eleanor read them slowly, her heart swelling. Her story had opened a door, but now others were walking through it. At the reception afterward, the director of the foundation approached her with a glass of sparkling water. "Mrs. Callahan, do you realize what you've done?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "I went for a walk into the world. That's all." The director shook his head. "No, you gave people permission to do the same." That night, in her hotel room, Eleanor sat by the window overlooking the lit-up city streets. She opened her notebook and wrote, "A single suitcase opened into 1,000 journeys. I thought I was walking alone. I see now I was never alone at all." As the exhibition prepared to travel to other cities, Eleanor felt both humbled and amazed. Her story had escaped the small circle of her family, her town, even her own life. It belonged now to countless others, each ready to prove that age was not an ending but an open horizon. And as she closed her notebook, she knew this was not her final chapter, but simply another beginning. By the time the exhibition reached its third city, Eleanor's life had shifted in ways she could never have predicted. She was still the same woman who made her tea every morning and kept her notebook by the window. But her days now carried a sense of connection that stretched far beyond her quiet town. Letters continued to arrive, not just a few each week, but dozens, sometimes from children, sometimes from people older than she was, all sharing dreams they had finally dared to chase. She read each one slowly, often more than once, and tucked them into boxes labeled carefully by month. One letter stood out. It came from a woman named Lucia, aged 24, who lived in a small rural town and confessed she had never left her county. "I take care of my younger siblings," she wrote. "Everyone tells me I need to be realistic, that dreams can wait, but reading about you, I feel like maybe waiting is the same as giving up. How do I start?" Eleanor held the letter for a long time before answering. When she finally wrote back, her words were simple. "Start small, but start. Even the shortest step changes the view." She sealed the envelope, hoping it would be enough. The traveling exhibition expanded into something larger than anyone had anticipated. At each stop, the wall of dream notes grew longer, rows of cards fluttering gently as visitors pinned their words. The curators eventually began photographing them, creating a digital archive so the collection would never be lost. When Eleanor visited in person, she often found herself moved to tears, reading strangers' handwriting confessing what they had once kept hidden. A boy in Ohio wrote, "I want to sing in front of people without being afraid." A grandmother in Texas wrote, "I want to go back to school to finish what I started at 19. These notes reminded her that the journey was no longer hers to carry alone. It had become a chorus, each voice adding to a larger song. One evening, after an event in Chicago, Eleanor found herself in conversation with a group of young students. They crowded around her with questions, their eyes wide with curiosity. One asked, "Do you ever get tired of telling the same story over and over?" She smiled. "I don't tell it because it's mine. I tell it because it belongs to anyone who needs to hear it. If even one of you walks out of here believing you're not too late, then it's worth telling again." Her family worried sometimes that she was exhausting herself. "You've already done more than enough, Mum," her daughter insisted one evening. But Eleanor shook her head gently. "I didn't start this to do enough. I started it to keep living, and I still am." That summer, she returned briefly to the seaside inn where she and Margaret had stayed. Margaret had passed away quietly a few months earlier, and Eleanor wanted to honor her friend's memory. She stood at the same shoreline where Margaret had first touched the ocean, holding one of the seashells they had collected together. She whispered, "We made it," and placed the shell back into the tide. Watching the water carry it away, she felt both grief and gratitude. Margaret's journey had ended, but the courage she embodied had flowed outward, touching countless others. Back home, Eleanor wrote in her notebook once more, "The road continues, even when our steps do not. What we begin in courage lives longer than we do." She closed the book, placed it gently on the table, and smiled. Her story had started with one suitcase. Now it traveled in thousands of hands, thousands of hearts, reminding her and everyone else that the horizon never truly ended. As autumn settled once more, Eleanor found herself invited to the exhibition's final stop, New York City. The foundation had arranged for the display to be housed in a vast hall at the public library, a place she remembered from her youth only in postcards and films. Now, to her astonishment, she would walk its marble floors as the centerpiece of an exhibit that had touched thousands. Her children insisted on accompanying her, and her grandchildren treated the trip as an adventure, bustling around her with wide eyes as the city's skyline came into view. On the opening night, the library's great hall was lit with golden chandeliers, and rows of visitors pressed forward to see the story of the woman who had refused to be told. She was too old. Glass cases held her postcards, her photographs, Margaret's seashells, and the journals sent by strangers around the world. A wall of dream notes stretched longer than she had ever imagined, each card a whisper of longing and courage. Pinned beside the others, standing before it, Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She had started with one postcard sent home in defiance. Now there were thousands, each one a promise of a life in motion. The director of the foundation guided her to the podium at the center of the hall. The crowd hushed as she approached. Eleanor looked out at the faces young and old, strangers and families, and, for a moment, she felt the weight of all the years behind her. She had once been dismissed as fragile, invisible, finished. Yet here she was, holding the attention of hundreds. She leaned into the microphone and began, her voice steady. I was told I was too old to travel, too old to chase dreams, too old to begin again. But the truth is, age is only the measure of time. It is not the measure of possibility. She paused, letting the words settle. When I set out, I carried only a suitcase and a stubborn refusal to stay still. I never dreamed it would carry me here. But what matters most is not my story. It's yours. Each of you has something you've set aside, something you've convinced yourself is too late. Tonight, I want you to remember, it is not too late, not ever. Applause erupted, long and unbroken, echoing off the marble walls, until Eleanor had to steady herself on the podium. She smiled faintly, humbled by the sound. After the speech, people lined up to meet her. Some brought their own postcards, some brought books for her to sign, others simply wanted to clasp her hand. A woman whispered that she had booked her first trip abroad after reading Eleanor's story. A man confessed he had finally enrolled in evening classes. Each encounter felt like another pebble dropped into water, rippling outward beyond her sight. Later, when the hall had emptied and the lights dimmed, Eleanor lingered by the wall of dream notes. She read them quietly, running her fingers along the strings that held them. One card caught her eye. In careful, childlike handwriting, it read, I want to take my grandma to see the ocean. Eleanor pressed her hand over her heart, thinking of Margaret, and whispered, yes, do it. That night in her hotel room, she sat with her notebook open on her lap. She wrote slowly, savoring each word. The suitcase was mine. The journey became ours. And now it belongs to everyone who dares to step forward. She closed the notebook gently and placed it beside her bed. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but Eleanor felt a calm deeper than the noise. She had carried her story as far as she could. The rest, she knew, would be carried on by others, by every dream pinned to a wall, by every step taken toward a horizon once thought unreachable. And in that knowledge, she felt not an ending, but a beginning that would outlast her.